Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today is day 31, and we're introducing a new case today, the prepositional case. And the reason we're doing this now is to prepare ourselves to talk about going places in Russian, being in places and also going to places and coming from places. And when we get to those topics, we're going to see that Russian verbs of motion are very difficult. This is going to be one of the hardest topics in this textbook and indeed in all of Russian grammar. To give you a quick preview, essentially the problem is that in English, where we simply use, in most cases, the rather vague verb to go, in Russian, we're going to have to draw very careful distinctions based on what type of motion we're really talking about. For example, is it a round trip? Are we on our way somewhere, being underway, or are we setting off for a destination? So based on those distinctions, for example, we're going to choose between three completely distinct forms of the verb in Russian. So we'll get to that in a few days. For now, we're just going to concentrate on talking about location, and we're going to do that with the prepositional case. In fact, in some textbooks, you may see the prepositional case called the locative case. I think that's not very common nowadays, at least in Russian textbooks, but watch out for it. So the reason we don't call this case the locative case is that we don't, it doesn't always involve location. So in today's lesson, we are going to be talking mostly about location using the prepositions v and na, which both take the prepositional case when they're talking about location. But for example, there's another very important preposition or, which also takes the prepositional case, but it means about, right? So it clearly has nothing to do with location. For our previous cases, like the genitive, we said it basically involves possession. The dative is used for indirect objects. The accusative is used for direct objects. Right. So up to now, we've been able to give sort of broad definitions that get to the essence of what the case is used for. With the prepositional, the best definition really is that the prepositional case is used after certain prepositions. That's really the best we can do. Again, many of them involve location, but not all. And so just remember prepositional case, think prepositions. We've got to remember these very important prepositions like v, na, and or. Those are the major ones. V means in, na means on, and or means about. Right? Those are all followed by the prepositional case. Another quick note is that the prepositional case, apart from the nominative, of course, is the only case that cannot be used without a preposition. So if we think back to how we use the genitive, the dative, the accusative, right? Of course, those are used after certain prepositions, but they can also be used without any preposition. Just put a word all by itself into example the genitive case, right? And that genitive case ending is showing that what role the word is playing in its sentence, right? For example, expressing some idea of, right? Like Книга студента would be the book of the student, right? The student's book. Or конец фильма, right? The end of the film, right? That filma is in the genitive, and that's showing us the relation, right? Without any preposition needed, as we would normally or quite often need in English, right? So remember, prepositional case used after certain prepositions, and indeed it cannot be used without a preposition. It wouldn't make any sense, basically. I think there's a footnote somewhere in the book. The only place I've ever seen the prepositional case used without a preposition is in kind of history books about the days when they would use telegrams, right? And you would pay per letter, right? So in that case, you would see, for example, phrases like Moskvia, meaning something like I'm in Moscow, right? But in normal spoken Russian, of course, you would need the preposition, and that would be v, and our full phrase would be not Moskvia, but v Moskvia, right? So anyway, let's dive right in and look at the some prepositional case endings. Here's to start off with, we have a poster with a little rhyming couplet from Mayakovsky. Нет на свете прекрасней одежи, чем бронза мускулов и свежесть кожи. There are no more beautiful raiments in the world than the bronze of muscles and freshness of skin. Right? Note that одежи and кожи, right? Those are the rhymes right on the end of the two lines here in the couplet. Mayakovsky, as we've mentioned, is a very famous Soviet poet. We'll read some of his work at the end of book 2. Right, so where do we see here the prepositional case? Na sviete, right? Sviet means the world, and na sviete means in the world, or understood a bit more literally, on the world, right? So we'll talk more about why we're using na here in a moment, but in short, sviet, the world, is thought of as a very broad, open space, right? So in the Russian mind, we're not in the world, but in a certain sense on the world. That is, we're in this huge open space. Okay, so let's look at a few examples with the prepositional case. Again, in today's lesson, we're going to be using the prepositional to describe location, right? The prepositional case is going to be used following v or na to describe location. So let's think first of the very literal meanings of these prepositions. V can be literally understood to mean in, right? We're literally inside something. Whereas na can be understood literally as on, right? Like on a flat surface. Okay, but as we'll see here in a moment in more detail, either of those could translate into English as at, right? Just the way we would use at to just describe kind of location generally, like at work, at a party, whatever, right? But again, literally, v means inside, na means on. Let's look at a few examples. В комнате, in the room. В театре, in the theater. В окне, in the window. Okay, you may notice a pattern with these endings, right? We have a feminine комната, a masculine театр, and a neuter окно, and they're all taking yeah in the prepositional, right? So we're going to be getting yeah for almost all nouns. Let's keep going. В музее, на столе, на стуле, на лекции, на уроке. Okay, we see one exception, and that is the special soft noun leksia. And as we'll see when we get to our table, this prepositional case is another reason why we have to group special soft nouns separately in Russian, right? Because it's taking an ending here that's not predictable. It doesn't match up with the other endings, right? Namely, we have na lekции, which looks a lot like the ending we saw in the dative case, if you remember. It's the identical ending. And again, it's another reason why we have to group special softs separately. Okay, so again, mostly we'll be using the prepositional case to describe location, but as we mentioned, there are other prepositions that take the prepositional case, including or, right? Very important. It means about, and it's followed by the prepositional. So for example, о языке, about language, о еде, about food, о словаре, about the dictionary, о России. Okay, so there's another special soft, right? И об истории, about history. Note the б there. We'll talk about when to write the б in a moment. О русской литературе, about Russian literature. Okay, so one other preposition that takes the prepositional case is pri, and that's a lot less commonly seen than the three we've just previewed, right? Pri most literally means something like near or at. That was sort of its original meaning. Nowadays, it's not really used like that very often. It's used more often in sort of figurative senses. For example, при коммунизме means literally something like in the presence of communism, meaning under, we would say in English, under communism, or in the time of communist rule, right? При Сталине would also mean literally in the presence of Stalin, understood temporally, right? Under Stalin, right? During Stalin's reign. Other examples, somewhat different in meaning. При выходе means while exiting or upon exiting. Now, выход there, the noun means an exit or a walking out of, and we'll talk more about this kind of noun in the future. But for now, just an example. При выходе, you'll hear the phrase in the subway, при выходе из поезда. Upon exiting the train, upon walking out of the train, don't forget your things. The full phrase is при выходе из поезда Не забывайте свои вещи, right? Upon exiting the train, don't forget your things. Не забывайте свои вещи. Or one other little phrase, при себе, that means in something like, again, in one's own presence, or we'd say in English, on one's person. Okay, so those are a few examples. We may see a few of these used in the sense of the first two examples, right? Like speaking of historical periods. But otherwise, we won't be seeing pre very often. Okay, as we noted already, the prepositional case has to follow a preposition, right? So if we think back to the genitive, у моего друга есть машина, right? There it is used after у, but then we can also use it, a noun in the genitive without any preposition, right? Depending on the construction, это машина моего друга. Okay, that's perfectly fine, of course, right? Because we're expressing the relationship there just through the case endings. We don't need a preposition in Russian. So again, the prepositional case is a bit of an exception in that sense. So to take an example, teatr, right, the theater. If you simply say teatre in Russian, that makes no sense. Right now, a Russian may think for a moment and realize, well, that's a prepositional ending, so maybe he or she misheard or whatever, something. But basically, it makes no sense, and it's certainly horrible grammar, right? This is a clear-cut mistake. You have to have a preposition. And this may sound like an easy point, but I get students all the time dropping the preposition, even when they're like filling in simple tables, right, where you would think it would be obvious, right? But you can't sort of assume that the preposition is going to be understood. You've got to include it every time you use the prepositional case. Let's look at a quick poster about the collective farms. В нашем колхозе нет места попам и кулакам. In our collective farm, that's the kolkhoz, or the коллективное хозяйство, the collective, collective farm, basically, right? Kolkhoz for short, and here we have our phrase in the prepositional, в нашем колхозе, in our collective farm, right, expressing location, of course. Нет места, a non-existence phrase with the genitive. There is no place. And then we get two dative plurals, which we haven't studied yet. There's no place for priests and kulaks. Okay, so I think we've talked already about what a kulak is. And again, this poster is, is basically gesturing to this brutal policy of collectivization, right, that gave rise to these collective farms. We've talked about that already. I don't want to rehash that, but again, it's certainly a very ugly chapter in Soviet history. Okay, prepositional endings. So let's now finally get our endings. The prepositional case will answer the question, a question like о чем or о ком, right? So in this case, we've chosen the or to give our example, to ask the question. And after or, we need the prepositional forms of что and кто, right? So again, we're learning a new case today. We have to learn not only our adjective and noun endings, but also the forms of the question pronouns, right? Кто and что, right? Those are, again, о чем or о ком. Now, again, we could pick a different preposition, right? We could say, ask the question, in what or in whom? That would be в чем, в ком, right? We'd use the same preposition. But again, it wouldn't make sense to ask the question, чем, ком, right? That makes no sense in Russian. We've got to pick a preposition. Okay, so let's look at our endings finally. And we see this is fairly simple. Masculine and neuters, we know already that those typically act very similarly. And the prepositional is no exception, right? Adjectives are going to take om. And now if we have a soft adjective, which we haven't really seen yet actually, or some kind of spelling rule issue, right? Remember with the 5-letter spelling rule, we would get yem, right? For example, with the adjective хороший, if you think back to those spelling rule issues. And the nouns will take yeah for the most part. Feminines, oi, or again, based on spelling rule issues or softness, we could see yay, and nouns are taking yeah. Okay, so we see by default, we can think that all nouns are taking yeah in the prepositional, so this is quite easy. Now, as we look over the table here, we've got to look at the black boxes. Those are the special softs. that are taking an unpredictable ending. They're not taking yeah. Instead, we're getting ee. All right, so let's read across, including the special modifiers. And again, we'll note that they may be slightly unpredictable, although not really, right? Although, well, I should say that maybe the most unexpected thing here is we're getting yom in some cases, right? Basically, you've got a soft stem followed by om, and that's giving us the spelling yom. Okay, so этом, всем, одном, чьем, моем, нашем, новом. Okay, there's just an ordinary adjective, новом. And then some nouns, столе, словаре, музее, кафетерии. It's worth remembering that there are no silent yes, no silent e's in Russian whatsoever, right? So these endings are certainly pronounced. They constitute a full syllable. Look, for example, at the prepositional for museum, muzeye, muzeye. Now, keep in mind, of course, just to be clear, that in this table, which is just for reference, we don't have prepositions. But again, to actually use this form muzeye in actual Russian, we would need a preposition of one sort or the other. Okay. Look at feminines. Этой, всей, одной, чьей, моей, нашей, новой. And now some nouns. Газете, неделе, and again, фамилии, фамилии. Neuters look pretty much like masculines, as we know, but look again, special soft neuters like задание, right? About the assignment would be о задании, right? О задании. Okay, let's do a few of these. Refer to the table as needed. We've got to learn these endings before we can start using the prepositional. So let's answer the question here, о чем, about what? Okay, and in response, of course, we would repeat the preposition and follow it with the prepositional case. Русская музыка. So let's say about Russian music. That's a feminine noun there. О русской музыке. О русской музыке. Now, I think we'll return to this in a moment, but you may recall that if we have an o in a preposition, that's going to be reduced to a, right? Always to a. So you may notice I'm not really saying o, I'm saying a. О русской музыке. Number two, новый словарь, about the new dictionary. That would be о новом словаре. О новом словаре. Number three, старый профессор, about the old professor, right? О чем, or in this case, our question should really be о ком, right? About whom? О ком. О старом профессоре. О старом профессоре. Number four, Русский музей, about the Russian museum. О русском музее. Again, practice your pronunciation, музее. 3 vowels in Russian, that means 3 full syllables. Right, the Russian Museum, that of course is the famous, beautiful museum of Russian art in Petersburg. And then the big museum in the former Winter Palace that houses mostly European art is the Hermitage. Okay, now, can you guess why we're using ob here? You may have already picked up on the pattern. Because the word following it, Hermitage, begins with a vowel sound, right? So it's sort of like the English indefinite article a or versus an, right? We supply the n when we're going to follow that indefinite article up with a noun starting with a vowel, right? Like an article. I read an article, right? Same principle here, and that gives us об Hermitage. Number 6, наше общежитие, our dorm. About our dorm would be о нашем общежитии. Okay, that's a special soft, right? So и о нашем общежитии. Твоя идея, about your idea, would be о твоей идее. Again, at the end of the word, right, in the prepositional. О твоей идее. Number 8, вся ваша работа, about all your work. Okay, watch out for the special modifier. Вся, the real trick there is to remember that it's soft, right? We can see that simply by looking at this form вся. So let's keep it soft, and we'll get о всей вашей работе. Number 9, это задание. So let's say about this assignment. Again, it's going to be followed by это, right? A vowel sound, so we supply the b, and we get об этом задании. Об этом задании. 10, твой русский друг, about your Russian friend. О твоем русском друге. Right? Твоем, watch that form, it's somewhat unpredictable. О твоем русском друге. Да, новая пословица, a new saying. Что кого болит, тот о том и говорит. So look at the о том, right? About that. Right? This is a tricky proverb. Again, a lot of these are very pithy and they're a little bit hard to handle. I wouldn't worry too much if you don't really understand them. Of course, a lot of them do involve some grammar we haven't seen yet, inevitably. But the basic structure here is что, то. Right? Что у кого болит, that which hurts someone. Well, that person talks about that, right? The person talks about that very thing that hurts them. Meaning, I guess people are somewhat selfish in terms of talking about what really directly concerns them, what hurts them, or whatever. Okay, let's look quickly at adjectives affected by the spelling rules in the prepositional case. So we mentioned this already. We're back to the old spelling rules. Here, in this case, the 5-letter rule is the one that's affecting the prepositional with adjectives like хороший. So we should be used to this by now, right? It's really nothing new. Basically, if you think about it, the endings om and oi, right, on adjectives, for example, well, we couldn't write those if they were following a je, che, sh, or tse in an unstressed position, right? That's the old 5-letter spelling rule, right? So if we have that in an adjective like хороший, we're going to have to write yeah instead, right? And that gives us в хорошем музее, in a good museum, or в хорошей комнате, in a good room. Now remember that if the adjective ends in a sh but is in stress, like большой, then you've got the stressed or. There's no problem with writing that. So that would indeed be в большом музее, большой комнате. No problem with that spelling. Okay, let's look at a few details regarding pronunciation. We've probably touched on most of these already, but because the prepositional case is so common, including after the preposition v, we need to remind ourselves, how do we read that preposition, right? It usually strikes students as somewhat odd when they're first encountering these prepositions, that you've got basically an entire word, an entire preposition that's just one consonant, right? It seems a little bit odd maybe to English speakers. And the question obviously is, how do you read it, right? It doesn't have a vowel of its own, right? So it isn't really a word. Heck, it's not even a syllable, right? Unless we have a mobile vowel thrown in or something. More about that later. Okay, so in instances like this in Russian, we read that preposition as though it were part of the word directly following it, right? In fact, you could pretend that they were written as a single word, right? And that may help you pronounce it more clearly, because of course, when we see that division on the page, preposition, space, and the word afterwards, we're tempted to break that up in terms of pronunciation as well, right? To insert a little pause after the v or whatever, but Russians don't normally do that. In fact, they almost never do it unless they're speaking really, really, really clearly, like maybe with a bad telephone connection or something like that. This is an extremely important principle of Russian pronunciation. It comes up all the time. And remember, this would be true of any preposition that is simply a single consonant. So I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to practice this and get a handle on it. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Okay, first let's talk about vowel reduction, right? Now we know that or will reduce in an unstressed position, and that would be just as true for these adjectival endings with an or, right? Like om and oi. Well, if those are unstressed, we're not going to say om or oi. We're going to say or oi. Right now, we've already seen that oi example with the genitive endings, right? We've got the same endings. By the way, students ask about that quite often as well, right? We may have already discussed this, right? There are cases in Russian where certain case endings coincide, right? So, as you may have noticed, the oi or oi ending we're seeing here with the feminine prepositional. Well, we saw that same ending also for the feminine genitive singular and also the feminine dative singular, right? So we've seen that oi ending already in 3 different cases. Right, that just to point out the obvious, that is ambiguous, right? If you were to see a word with that ending just all by itself, you wouldn't be able to guess what case it is. You would need some kind of context. Okay, so let's just practice pronunciation here. В новой комнате, right? Look where the stress is. We have an unstressed o, and we pronounce it as So not в новой, but в новой, o, в новой. And you may already notice that we're pronouncing the v and the word directly after it as though they were a single word. В новой комнате. Or here's an om example, в новом парке. So not в новом, but в новом парке. But remember, if it's stressed or, like in an unstressed adjective, then of course we wouldn't reduce it and we'd say в большой комнате, in a big room, or в большом парке, in a big park. Okay, let's practice now with right? Just again, look how we could write this as we've done here in the examples as a single word. And of course, Russians would never do that, but just for study purposes, that's a good way to think about these phrases, right? Because we need to pronounce them as though they were indeed a single word. So, in the store, в магазине. In the bar, в баре. In the sky, в небе. In Moscow, в Москве. In Russia, в России. In Washington, в Вашингтоне. Okay, if you're speaking very clearly there, you may hear kind of a double length, kind of a double v there, в Вашингтоне. Now, of course, if someone's speaking quickly, you may not really hear any additional length there. You may just hear something like Вашингтоне. And again, because of the ending yeah, you can tell that there is indeed a preposition v there, even though you might not necessarily hear it very clearly. Now, if you think back to our introduction to pronunciation, the finer points of pronunciation, I think on day 2 or day 3, we talked about devoicing voiced consonants, for example, at the end of a word. Or a somewhat trickier topic, when you have clusters of consonants, then typically in Russian, the first consonant in the cluster will assimilate to the second consonant, right? The following consonant in terms of being voiced or unvoiced, right? Now, because we're reading these prepositional phrases as though they were a single word, we can end up with consonant clusters, right? That v, or what normally would be pronounced as a v, right, as voiced. Remember all that, that's a voiced consonant. You can feel the buzzing down here, right? If that v is followed by a word that begins with an unvoiced consonant, like for example, like ka, right, no voicing, then we end up with a cluster. We're pronouncing it again as if it were a single word. So we have the two consonants coming right up against each other, and that ka will cause the preceding v to be devoiced, in this case to a f, right, to an f sound, right? Remember the v sound, the devoiced equivalent of that is f, right? So let's look at a few examples. In the room, again, look what's happening. We've got a v colliding with an unvoiced consonant ka, and so we say в комнате, в комнате. Right, we have the assimilation of the first consonant in the cluster to the second consonant. In the theater, again, let's think for a moment. Te, is that a voiced consonant? No, it's not, right? Just practice saying it a few times and you can tell there's no buzzing, there's no vibration anywhere when you're producing that te. So it's unvoiced, and so the v is devoiced, and we say v teatrie, v teatrie. In Petersburg, pe, right? Make that sound, right? No vibration, it's unvoiced. The v assimilates to it, and we say v Peterburgie, v Peterburgie. Now, we already noted that the prepositions, they end up being unstressed, and so they reduce, right? As we mentioned a moment ago, they always reduce to a, right? So a knigie, a vойне, about the war, обо мне, about me. That's a special form there that we see only with мне, at least for our purposes. Right, that's you can think of that as an exception. That's quite unusual, actually. Обо мне is how we say about me. I think we'll revisit that later. Okay, let's for practice, you could try just writing. Look at these phrases all with v, and just as a fairly simple exercise, let's write the v and the word that follows it as a single word. Right, and that's really, again, you would never ever write that. Except maybe in this exercise, right? But in terms of pronunciation, that's the way you want to think of these phrases. So I'm going to write these out as I read them, and read what you see on the screen, right? Not necessarily what we would normally write, with the space, because again, the problem is that it tempts you to pause in your pronunciation. That visual cue, right, of that visual space almost always causes students to introduce a pause. And again, we really can't have any pause there whatsoever, and we certainly can't have a full vowel, right? So, for example, they'll say things like v etei or v etei, right? Anything like that is incorrect. We need to say vetei, vetei, right? And if we write those two parts together, it becomes clearer what we're really saying, vetei. Right, as though it were a single word. В этой квартире, right, in this apartment. В хорошем общежитии. Okay, there we have the devoicing, right? So we're really saying f, and let's go ahead and write that just to fully show what we're actually saying. В хорошем общежитии. В хорошем. Number 3, в городе. В городе. Okay, g, right? You have to your vocal cords need to vibrate to pronounce a g, right? So we keep the v, right? No devoicing, and we say в городе, в городе. Number 4, ts, okay, that's unvoiced. So we're going to say в центре, в центре, в центре города, in the center of the city or downtown. Number 5, again, here the masculine example, в этом, в этом доме. Number 6, in the trade center, in the shopping mall. В торговом центре. Okay, ask yourself, is there devoicing here? В торговом центре. Yes, because of the t, right? That's not voiced, unvoiced, so we get f, an F sound. And finally, в парке. В парке. Yes, again, we have devoicing because, right, unvoiced consonant, so we get an F sound. А еще говорят, в Москве кур даят. Right, literally, and still they say in Moscow they are milking chickens. Meaning, next thing you know, they'll be talking about milking chickens in Moscow, right? The next new thing, right? Doesn't sound very plausible. Okay, so obviously our phrase there in the prepositional is в Москве, in Moscow. Okay, let's talk quickly about choosing between v and na. So we already mentioned that these prepositions can be understood very literally. V meaning inside and na meaning on a flat surface like a table or some other kind of sprawling open flat space. Okay, so usually that distinction holds up fairly well, um, but we have to say a bit more about it, right? Let's look quickly at a poster. В небесах, на земле и на море. In the skies, on the ground, and on the sea. Right? So you see there, we're choosing between va and na. And you may see already that this may not be entirely clear sometimes, right? I mean, isn't the sky a big open space? Well, yeah, it is sort of. And, indeed, in some instances, you can use na to talk about being, as it were, on the sky. Here we have v в небесах, in the heavens, in the skies. But then the earth and the sea, well, that makes sense, I guess. Those are big open spaces on the ground, on the sea. Now, in some instances, of course, you could use either, right? Because what if you're in the ground or in the sea, right? You're underwater. Well, that, of course, would be v. So essentially, we're going to see that some Russian nouns we'll call them v nouns, and we can think of that sort of as the default for talking about location, right? We are in a location. Other nouns we'll call na nouns because they will simply take na to describe the given location. Now, sometimes that can be understood clearly as meaning literally on whatever the location is, like again, on the table. But other times, maybe not so much, right? And then in other instances, depending on the meaning of the noun, right, you could have either. Again, you could be on the ground or in the ground, right? And in that case, you would choose based on the literal meaning. Okay, so let's look at some examples here in more detail. We can think of, again, v as the default for describing location, right? For telling где, right? Where. For example, в комнате, в рюкзаке, в библиотеке, в окне. Now, for all of these, for examples, we can think of these as meaning literally inside. Although, in English, a lot of times we say at for no particular reason, right? Someone's at the library. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? Now, so the question, if v is our default preposition for describing location, then when do we use na? We can think of na as somewhat exceptional. Now, of course, the first use of na is totally obvious when we literally mean on a flat surface. На столе, на земле, на стене. Okay, note that that's a horizontal surface, but we still, just like we say in English, on the wall, right? In Russian, we say на стене, or again, another vertical surface on the blackboard, that's на доске. Okay, here's another really important category, and this one works universally. Events, right? Anything where people are gathering, parties, performances, lectures, Russian class, meetings. Events are always going to be na. На вечеринке, на лекции, на встрече, на балете, right there, a performance, right, is also an event. You may note quickly that if you say you're going to the theater, that's thought of as a building, right? The theater itself is not an event, right? So teatr is a v noun, right? В театре would mean at the theater, right? Now, if you're talking about something being performed in the theater, the actual performance, that's an event, right? So again, you would say something like na balete, meaning at this event, at the ballet. Now, this is another thing that comes up quite often. Could you say v balete? Could you say in the ballet? Yes, if you were actually in the performance, right? If you were a ballerina, a dancer in the ballet, literally, then you would say v balete. But for most of us who aren't particularly talented, I'm not very good at ballet personally, so I would pretty much never say that, right? It would be na balete, na balete. Okay, number 3, going by vehicles. Okay, so we'll practice this more later, right? Usually vehicles are going to take на поезде, на машине, на велосипеде, на метро. Okay, so we'll practice that more later. Now, you would only say something like в поезде if you mean quite literally inside the vehicle, you're kind of emphasizing literally being inside it, not just kind of taking it for a ride, right? So if you wanted to say something like it was cold in the train, or it was stuffy in the train, quite literally thought of as an enclosed space, then you could use the. But for vehicles, we should think of them as na nouns by default when we're talking about taking transportation. Finally, points of the compass. Okay, that makes sense. Kind of big, open, geographical spaces. Na севере, на юге, на востоке, на западе. And finally, what about the exceptions? Well, there are certain spaces in Russian that are treated as non-nouns, and it's not always clear why that is, right? So in some cases, we just need to learn that a given noun is a non-noun in Russian. We don't necessarily have to understand why. For example, na vokzale, literally on the train station. Okay, so usually with these, you could think of some historical reason why, train station might be a non-noun. Because if you think of a big train station, it's kind of a big, open, sprawling space. You have quite often the open platforms. And so if you have a big, complex, sprawling space like this, often those will be non-nouns as well. But again, this rule doesn't really take us very far, right? It doesn't always hold up. So anyway, let's look at some more important examples. Na vokzale, again at the train station. Na stanции, at the station. На остановке, at the bus stop. На стадионе, at the stadium. На почте, at the post office. And finally, на работе, на работе. Could maybe think of that as an event, but it maybe doesn't really quite line up, right? So just think again, if you're saying at work, you're literally on work. Another example that confuses students, a city, right? Cities are v, right? So in the city is v goroде. Okay, so isn't a city a sprawling open space, right? This doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, sometimes, again, if you think about things in an historical context, the Russian becomes a bit clearer because historically, of course, cities, especially Russian cities, were walled, right? They had fortress walls around them. And indeed, that's what the Kremlin actually is, right? That's the very center of Moscow, right? Has these fortified brick walls. That's the Kremlin, right? And then as the city grew, they kept building, walls further and further out. Right, so you were literally inside the city, meaning you were inside the city walls. And indeed, the word gorod, that word actually means really, it has to do with a wall, right? It doesn't really have anything to do historically with the city per se. In fact, actually, it's cognate with the English yard and garden. Both of those words are related to the Russian gorod. But at any rate, again, it's a v noun. So we say things like v goroде, in the city, or v Moskvе, in Moscow. Okay, let's give a few examples. In the restaurant, well, that's going to be v. Again, we're going to choose v by default, right? If you have to guess v, right? В ресторане, в ресторане. Okay, what about an island? Well, in English, we say on an island. That's a pretty good clue that in Russian, we're going to get na. And that's the correct answer, na ostrovye, right? A sprawling, flat, open space, na ostrovye. Number 3, in the bedroom. Well, that'll be v. Spalnie, spalnie. Number 4, at the concert. Okay, remember that is an event. Okay, so that's a huge category that's very straightforward. If we're talking about an event, a gathering, that's going to be a non-noun in Russian. So, na koncertie, na koncertie. Number 5, on the sidewalk. Okay, unless you've been the victim of a mob hit or something and you were buried in concrete under the sidewalk. Again, maybe you could think of some ridiculous scenario where you would use v. But again, obviously, trottoir is a flat space. In any normal circumstance, it would be a non-noun. Na trottoarie, na trottoarie. Number 6, zapad. That's the point of the compass. Those are non-nouns, so we would say na zapade, in the west. Now again, note how that doesn't line up, right? In English, we say in the west or in the east or whatever. In Russian, that's literally on the west. Okay, so again, we can't rely too much on English. Кто в Москве не бывал, красоты не видал. He who has not been in Moscow has not seen beauty. By the way, there we have krasota in the genitive because it is the object of a negated verb, не видал, right? We mentioned already how we may see the genitive used for objects with a negated verb. Okay, let's look at a few examples, which again, just based on their meaning, we could use v or na depending on the context, what we really mean. Right, so in the river would be vrikia, on the river, meaning we're floating on the river, narikia, narikia. In the ground would be zimlia, but on the ground, na zimlia, just like we saw on the poster. In the grass, в travie, but on the grass, на travie. In the tree would be в дереве. On the tree would be на дереве. Let's see, in the sea would be в море. Note there's no change in the spelling there actually. On the sea, на море. And finally, inside the bus, literally, в автобусе. But what we would normally say on the bus, like I'm on the bus, I'm riding the bus, that would be на автобусе. And the Russian equivalent of when pigs fly, like I'll do that when pigs fly, that's когда рак на горе свистнет, when a crayfish whistles on a mountain, right? The phrase from гора, meaning mountain, we get на горе, когда рак на горе свистнет. Don't even ask me what on earth that means, how that got started, but of course you can see that it's very unlikely that a crayfish will whistle from a mountaintop, and so hence the expression, right, when pigs fly, right, meaning this will never happen. Okay, so that does it for the prepositional case. Tomorrow we'll talk a bit more about it, and then again, fairly soon we'll we'll transition to discussing verbs of motion, which will be a very challenging, but also, well, certainly a very useful and actually a rather interesting topic. And again, I have to warn you, we're going to treat this in just exhaustively. We're going to leave no stone unturned with these things, because this is a great example of a Russian topic that a lot of books will try to simplify. And again, for anyone serious about learning the language, the kiss of death is when you start trying to simplify it in ways that are simply dishonest, right? You learn a couple of rules of thumb and you think you've learned everything about the topic. And then years later, you realize, oh my God, I don't understand this at all, right? And so we're going to be very careful to lay this out in the whole system very exhaustively. And again, we'll come back and revisit this, practice it in the future. But in essence, there's going to be not a whole lot more left to say about these verbs of motion once we're done with them in this book. Okay, so until then, до свидания, товарищи.